Every time processing makes a mark on the screen, it uses two pieces of information. The first is, what's the shape of this thing? Is it a rectangle, an ellipse, the letter G? The second piece of information is, how should it look? What color does it have? Is it transparent? Maybe it has an outline. These two pieces of information are considered separate in processing. The idea of styles is what unites them. To create an object that you want to draw, first you set up the style. You tell processing how it should look when it gets drawn. And then you draw the thing. This is a really nice idea because it lets you separate how things look from the things themselves. Let's look at an example of this from the real world. Suppose that you're working with some people who paint houses. So you arrive at the first job and you say, in this house, I want you to paint the house itself beige and paint the trim white. And they say, great, no problem. The house is beige, the trim is white. They finish the house, they go on to the next house. And you don't make any changes. They say, okay, fine, beige house, white trim. And one house after another, no matter what the houses are, they all get painted with beige paint and white trim. And then at some point you reach a house and you say, for this one, I want you to change the trim color to light blue. They say, fine. We'll still paint the house beige. You haven't changed that. But now the trim is light blue. And every house that follows on gets beige paint with light blue trim. Then later you reach a house and you say, from now on, the house itself will be olive. But you don't change the color of the trim, so that stays light blue. And now from now on, every house will be olive with light blue trim. So this idea of saying, I have a house color and a trim color, that's the style. And then the houses are the things that get painted in those styles. So we have one style, color and trim color, and we apply that to every object we paint. Well, that's just how processing does it. Let's look at drawing a rectangle. If you've seen the video on rectangles, you know that we draw a rectangle with a command like this. And I'm just showing the rectangle command. There needs to be some other stuff ahead of it and some other stuff after it. But if we just issue this with numbers for this X, Y, W, and H, what we're telling processing to do is draw a rectangle on the screen with its upper left corner at X, Y, and a given width and a given height. Now, if we do this as a bare bones program without overwriting any of the style settings, we'll get this picture. By default, processing says the style is fill objects with white, draw a black outline around them, a black stroke, and make that stroke 1 pixel thick. So if this is the kind of rectangle you want, exactly this way, a thin stroke that's black with a white fill, you don't have to do a thing. That's the default style. But let's suppose you want to draw a different kind of a rectangle. Maybe one that's cyan inside with a red stroke. Well, to draw the rectangle, we still have to call rect. But if we want it to look different, we have to set up the style first. In processing, once something is drawn, it's done. So if we want to change the style, we set it up before the thing gets drawn. So I need to set the stroke and the fill colors. Let's start with the stroke. You set the stroke color by calling stroke. And within the parentheses, you give it the color. In this case, I'm giving it red, green, blue, where red is 180. That's a pretty bright red. No green and no blue. And if you look at the stroke, yeah, it's a pretty bright red. You can use HSB color values here if you want. So now I've set up a style that has all the defaults except that the stroke is red. Well, I also want to change the fill color, so I call fill. All one word. And fill just takes a color. In this case, again, red, green, blue. Red is 0. Green and blue are both moderately bright. Green and blue together make cyan. And so we get sort of a medium cyan. After calling this stroke and this fill, if I now call rectangle, as we have, this is the result. Now let's suppose we want to change the style in one more way. I want to use a thicker stroke around the outside. Well, we have to say that before we call the rectangle, so I'll move rect down. and I will call stroke weight. Notice that's all one word with a capital W. Stroke weight takes just one number, the thickness of the stroke in pixels. Now this set of 4 lines, when processing executes them and creates our picture, will cause it to draw this picture. The same rectangle we had, except the stroke is now 40 pixels thick. So this is how we set up our styles. We declare all the elements that go into the style, and then we draw stuff. And the style stays in effect until we change it. Notice that we never explicitly say, this is the style. The style is sort of more of a concept. The style is the collection of all of these commands that are in effect at the time you draw something. So if I draw a rectangle using the style we just created, I could get something like this. If I draw another rectangle and I don't change the style, well, it uses the same style. So now I'll change the style. Let's say I'll change all 3 components. I'll fill with green, I'll have a purple outline, and I'll make the stroke thin. And now I'll change them all again. So I change the style and then paint. So let's see how this might look if we were trying to build up a collection of, let's say, ellipses. The style, which we'll be looking at, is just made up of the fill color, the stroke color, and the stroke weight, or the thickness. So let's begin with kind of a yellow color for the fill, a red stroke, and a moderately thick weight. If I draw an ellipse with this style, we get an ellipse like that. I drew a tall, thin one. The shape of the ellipse doesn't matter. What's important is the fill, stroke, and stroke weight values. So now I'm going to draw another ellipse. I won't change any of the style things, and I'll mark that here. I'm making a new column, and these blue dots mean no change. So if I draw another ellipse, but I don't change the style, we get another ellipse. This time I made it a little shorter and a little fatter, but it's got the very same style. Now let's change one thing. Let's change the fill. And we would do that just by calling fill and giving it this color. Now, if we draw an ellipse, we get the same stroke weight and the same stroke color that we had before, but the new fill color. So let's just change a few more things. Suppose that now, after having drawn this ellipse, we have a line that says, here's a new stroke weight. And then we draw another ellipse. Well, we've made the stroke weight nice and fat, so if we draw an ellipse, in this case a circle, we get a nice fat stroke. Now let's change 2 things. I'm going to have 2 lines, one after the other. One that says the fill color is going to be light gray, the stroke color is dark gray, and I don't touch the stroke weight. If I draw an ellipse, those are the colors that are used for the fill and the stroke. Finally, I'll change just the stroke. And if I draw an ellipse, I get the same stroke weight and the same fill color, but the new stroke color. So let's actually do this in processing. Suppose I have the necessary lines before and after to make a picture. Let's recreate the style that we saw before from the rectangle. We begin by saying that we want to have kind of a bright red stroke. We want a fill color, which is kind of a bright cyan, and a 40-point wide stroke. Then I tell processing, draw a rectangle. And here I'm just using placeholders x1, y1, w1, h1. We would have real numbers in there in a real program. I don't want to get bogged down with the numbers in the rect call. So just think of this as draw a rectangle somewhere. And here's the rectangle we would get, drawn in the style we just created. So now I want to draw another thing. Let's say I want to draw an ellipse now, but I want it to have a yellow interior. So I change the fill color by calling fill, and I draw my ellipse. And processing inherits the old stroke color and the old stroke weight and draws the new ellipse. Now let's change the weight. I don't like that big fat line, so I'll change the stroke weight down to 10, which is still pretty thick, and I'll change the stroke color to sort of a brown. And now I say draw another ellipse. And processing draws an ellipse using our new style. And so this shows us the beauty of the style idea, because you can change just the things you need to change, and then draw. So if you want to draw 25 boxes that all have the same style, you set the style up once, and then just draw your boxes with no changes. But if you want some objects to look different, just change the style, and everything from that point will have the new style.